There are a total of 27 different loanwords and a total of 381 occurrences. Specifically, the book of Exodus contains 26 loanwords and 333 occurrences. Outside of these 3 books, and within the rest of the Hebrew Bible, there are only 51 Egyptian loanwords and 450 occurrences for a much larger section of the Bible. Given the ratio of distribution, there is a much smaller proportion of Egyptian loanwords in the rest of the corpus, when compared to the books that would be expected to have more affinity with an Egyptian past. Noonan says, when one compares the above data, it becomes evident that the Exodus and wilderness traditions contains a significantly higher proportion of Egyptian loanwords than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. From the standpoint of contact linguistics, this observation indicates that the Exodus and wilderness narratives, especially the narrative of the book of Exodus, exhibit greater Egyptian influence than the remainder of the Hebrew Bible. Noonan also compares this ratio in Exodus to books written later, such as Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These books have been shown to have Old Iranian influence, given that they reflect time periods of heavy Persian influence. However, Ezra and Nehemiah only contain 26 Old Iranian loanwords with 82 occurrences. The relative frequency of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus and wilderness traditions is significantly higher than the relative frequency of Old Iranian loans in Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. Some might argue early Canaanite cultures were heavily influenced by Egyptian intervention throughout the New Kingdom. But when we compare Hebrew to other Canaanite languages, we again find more Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus narrative than we do with other languages. There are very few Egyptian loanwords in Ugaritic and only one in Phoenician. Moabite, Ammonite, and Edomite contain no examples of known Egyptian loanwords. Old Aramaic contains 2, and as time progresses to Imperial Aramaic, you get an abundance of Egyptian loanwords. But the loanwords mostly show up in Egyptian Aramaic texts that were from Egypt. Even with that, Noonan writes, the ratio of occurrence of Egyptian loanwords to total word count, i.e. the relative frequency of Egyptian loans, is significantly higher in the Exodus and wilderness narrative than it is in Imperial Aramaic. Thus, the high amount of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus narrative is unique with regards to regional languages within the Levant. The question, of course, is how and when did this Egyptian influence occur on the Hebrew language? Noonan argues, based on the type of some of the loanwords we find in the book of Exodus, the most likely time for linguistic borrowing to occur would be during the Middle to Late Bronze Age. Some of the loanwords in Hebrew are feminine nouns that contain a specific ending, yet this ending drops off in later times. So the most likely time for this influence to occur is during the Bronze Age. James Hoffmeyer notes many of the personal names of the Pentateuch reflect the same time period of Egypt and likely have Egyptian roots. The name Moses is most likely a Hebraized version of the Egyptian name that could have come from the structure that shows up in names like Tutmos and Ramesses. Merari, son of Levi, is only attested among the Hebrews in the Semitic world, but was a common Egyptian name of the Middle Kingdom. Phineas is also most likely an Egyptian name that means Nubian. The name Asir might derive from the god Osiris. And we can identify several other names that likely have Egyptian roots. Now Richard Hess notes many of the names could potentially have a West Semitic origin. But West Semitic names have a strong presence in Egyptian texts from the New Kingdom. Hess also notes the names still reflect an early origin. All of these names have roots attested in the 2nd millennium BC. There is no personal name that appears only in the 1st millennium BC, and thus there is none that can be used to support the argument for the narrative being a fictional account written by scribes in the middle of the 1st millennium BC. By itself, this is a significant finding, for it affirms the names as appropriate to the time when the events of the Exodus and the surrounding narrative took place. It would be remarkable if scribes writing much later had not placed among 40 names some that were unique to their later periods and not attested in the 2nd millennium BC.